Hi, welcome to the Talk Spot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined by Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey, thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so tell us a little bit about your work and some of the topics that you've written about.
Sure. So I work on the biology of aging. I have always known throughout my whole life that aging was obviously the world's most important problem, as in the thing that causes the largest amount of suffering in the world. And the curious thing is that until my late 20s, I didn't realize that this was an unusual point of view. I thought that it was so obvious that I never even bothered to discuss it with anybody. But when I did find out that most people thought that aging was inevitable and universal and natural, and perhaps they even thought it was a blessing in disguise, I decided, well, I better do something about it. So at that point, I was a computer scientist. I was working in artificial intelligence research in order to contribute to what I view as another of the world's big problems. They're not nearly so big, namely the problem that people have to spend so much of their time doing stuff that they wouldn't do unless they were being paid for it. So we need more automation. But no, I was in a nicely fortunate position back then, around the age of 30, to be able to switch fields. So I did so, and I started to study the biology of aging. And about 20 years ago, I essentially initiated a revolution in the thinking in the expert community about how we might potentially keep people healthy and youthful later in life. And that paradigm shift, so to speak, has somewhat taken hold. And in my case, what this results in is that I am the chief science officer of a biomedical research charity based in California that works to develop these therapies. So the therapies are really, linked by one overarching conceptual idea, namely that what we want to do is actually repair the damage of aging, genuinely rejuvenate people and turn back their biological clock, rather than simply slow the clock down. Intuitively, most people had historically thought that actually turning the clock back would be intrinsically harder than slowing it down, but it turns out that the opposite is the case. And so, as I say, this way of thinking has now become very mainstream and orthodox, and a lot of people are pursuing it. And I have been able to have a fair amount of influence in helping the field to accelerate over the past few years, as well as, of course, overseeing the work that we ourselves do, which has been, I think, quite fundamental in actually making the field really be a realistic prospect.
Well, what are some factors, I guess, that impact how long a person can live for? Like, what are some of the main causes for a person to live to, let's say, only 75 years old?
Well, actually, the differences between people's ages at death are pretty small these days. Of course, 100 or 200 years ago, an awful lot of people would die of causes that had nothing to do with aging. They would die, literally more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1 from infections like tuberculosis. And now, in the industrialized world, virtually nobody dies very young. Even in the developing world, the death rates at early ages are plummeting. So, as you say, yes, the question really comes down to what accounts for the residual variability that we see in the ages at which people become sick and die from the chronic progressive conditions of late life. Now, to be honest, there's still a lot of dispute about that. Some of it seems to come down to the fact that people who are dying today of age-related causes just have had a better life throughout their lives than people who would have died maybe 30 years ago. So in particular, early life, even prenatal nutrition seems to play a big lifelong role in one's biological age, so to speak. Then there's, of course, other factors. We have had progress in medicine, and so there's a good deal of inequality based on simple access to expensive medical care. And then, of course, there is a genetic component, but the genetic component is relatively minor. It's maybe 25%, the heritability, as it's called, of the variability of longevity. However, I do want to emphasize in closing my answer that none of this really matters in terms of the work that we do, because what we're doing is to provide medicines that can completely transcend this relatively modest amount of variation that we see in today's population. At the moment, it doesn't matter how lucky you are genetically or prosperity-wise or anything like that, you're still going to get sick and die before the age of 120, and very probably before the age of 100. So that's what we want to fix.
And this question might sound, I want to ask it in a way that doesn't make me sound too dumb, but let's say, for example, if some alien race came to the planet Earth and they asked you, they said, explain to us the concept of aging, because on our planet, we don't have it or whatever. How would you explain what aging is to an entity that doesn't age?
So the only reason why your question isn't very sensible is because we can be absolutely certain that every species will have experienced aging and will have only escaped it by developing medicines that prevent it. And the reason I can say that is because aging is not even a phenomenon of biology. A phenomenon of biology, you might think, well, aliens might have different biology. But it's not a phenomenon of biology. It's a phenomenon of physics. It's a fundamental feature of the physical laws of the universe, that any machine with moving parts, whether we call it alive or not, what kind of, what stuff it's made of, whatever, any machine with moving parts is going to accumulate damage throughout its existence as an intrinsic side effect of its normal operation. This damage is basically, just changes to the molecular, cellular, atomic structure of the machine. And those changes are harmless in terms of impact on the function of the machine for quite a long time, because any machine, whether it's alive or not, whether it has been built by a designer or whether it's evolved, has a certain amount of tolerance. It's built to put up with a certain amount of this damage that accumulates, because otherwise the machine would just start to decline in function immediately from day one, which it doesn't. Machines work perfectly well for a while. They just have a warranty period after which they start going downhill. So this is basically, as I say, a phenomenon of physics that eventually the damage exceeds the threshold that the machine is set up to tolerate, and that's when function starts to become progressively less. So you can see that any alien race is going to have the same experience.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. I guess you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into it, is the concept of the trends of life expectancy. Because I know in the US, I haven't done like a ton of research into this, but it seems like every time life expectancy comes up, the topic in the US, it seems like the US is kind of trending a little downward, or at least that's what at least that's what the articles are saying. I guess one question I would ask is, like you mentioned earlier, so 100 years ago, life expectancy is way up from then, but in the last 50 years, or let's say last 35 years, something like that, are life expectancies actually getting longer, or has it kind of become stagnant? Like, I guess what does that trend look like?
Yeah, great question. So you're quite right that since, let's say, World War II, the rate of increase in life expectancy in every industrialized country has been much slower than what it was in, let's say, the first half of the 20th century. And that is fundamentally because by World War II, we had pretty much completed the process of eliminating infant mortality and mortality in childbirth and so on, these really early deaths caused by infections. We just got good enough at stopping those things from happening. And of course, you can only do that once, right? Once they're gone, you can't reduce them any further. So now the progress that has occurred since then has been on the chronic progressive life-threatening conditions that we see late in life. And I've already mentioned some of the reasons for that. And those reasons are also getting to the point now of hitting diminishing returns. Essentially, people who were reaching, let's say, the age of 70 in 1970, people who were born around the turn of the 20th century, those people were born in a considerably more prosperous environment on average than people who reached the age of 70 in, let's say, 1950. and that translated into having better health throughout their lives, and thereby, being older at the point that they started to come down with these chronic progressive conditions, and therefore also older when they died. But the impact of prosperity on early life nutrition and so on, there's only so far you can go. So now, if we compare people who are who are alive at age 70 today versus 20 years ago, then the difference in their prosperity when they were kids is much less. Let's say we're hitting diminishing returns. Now, the US is a kind of extreme example in another way, namely that you have the worst obesity epidemic in the world, in the developed world. And that certainly is a cause of a variety of different age-related health problems, especially diabetes, of course. So if we look at the US now, you guys are like number 45 or something like that in the league table of life expectancy right now, despite obviously spending massively more than any other country per capita on medical care. It's a bit laughable, really. But I don't want to overstate this. Because a really important thing to understand here is that the absolute number of years of variation that we're talking about is really, really small. The life expectancy in the US may be only, in terms of ranking, it may be in the 40s, but in terms of actual number of years, it's only about 5 years less than the number one country, like Japan, right? So really, everyone's getting the same problems at only slightly different rates.
Again, I guess this might be a little bit harder to necessarily answer because you have to do a little predicting. So I know sometimes when I have guests on, I always kind of want to phrase it in a way that's like, hey, I know you're asking to potentially guess the future, but I'll ask it anyways. Do you think, I guess, let's say 100 years from today, do you think it's possible we could see life expectancy hit 200 years or longer? Or do you think there is someone that's alive today that can theoretically live to be, I don't know, let's say 500 years old?
Okay, so first of all, let me respond to your apology for the question, because I don't think you should be apologizing. I think that, in general, scientists are right not to entertain and not to give opinions about time frame predictions, because they one just can't know. Science is like that. Einstein had this famous quote. He said, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. But in the case of medical research, and especially in the case of medical research on aging, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the number one cause of suffering in the world, I believe that experts such as myself do have actually not only an opportunity, but a moral obligation to actually do our best to make predictions. Of course, we have to emphasize how speculative those predictions are, but the fact is that most people are going to make up their own predictions if they don't get guidance from us, and those predictions are going to be wrong. And let me illustrate exactly how wrong by picking apart the way that you actually asked the question. What you said was, do I think that there's any chance that 100 years from now, we could be looking at life expectancies in the region of 200 or even 500 years? The reason you're asking it that way is because your guess is that, your intuition is that that's on the high end of expectations, right? That I might say, yeah, maybe, or I might say not a chance, but I'm definitely not going to say that is drastically over-conservative as a prediction. And it turns out that is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it's drastically over-conservative. Wow. That, in fact, I believe that most people alive today have a respectable chance of living to 1,000, or indeed any other number that you might think of. In other words, I think that most people alive today have a good chance of still being in a reasonably good state of health at the point when we develop therapies that, for all practical purposes, completely eliminate aging as a risk factor for getting sick and dying.
Wow.
Coming back to what I said about speculation, that what I just said arises from my estimate of how long it's going to take before we have a 50-50 chance of having effectively defeated aging with medicine. But there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years, right? In which case it won't be ready for anyone who's alive today. So I think my 50-50 time frame is about 17 years from now. That's why it would be in time for most people alive today. Of course, we also have to take into account what kind of medicine this is going to be, and that is, it's going to be rejuvenation medicine, medicine that actually turns back the clock. So I mentioned earlier on that was the big paradigm shift that I brought about. Medicine that we can apply to people who are already in middle age or older at the time that those medicines first come into existence, and can actually make those people biologically younger again. The enormous utility of that is that the medicines don't have to be particularly comprehensive in their first form, in their initial iteration that we achieve in, let's say, 17 years. All they need to do is buy enough time for people like me, the scientists, to develop improved medicine so that we can, periodically rejuvenate the same people with better and better medicine.
Wow. So if you wouldn't mind, could you dive a little bit deeper into actually, how rejuvenation works? Like actually what's actually literally happening when you do this?
Okay, so what we are aiming to get is a panel of interventions. This is not a one-stop, one single, pill that you take or injection you get. There's going to be a lot of different things that we're going to be doing to the same people at the same time, because it has to be that way, because damage repair, which is what rejuvenation is, implies that you're repairing all of the various types of damage that the body does to itself throughout life, and there's a hell of a lot of those. The body's a really, 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 really complicated machine. It does a lot of different types of damage. Really, the only reason why this is realistic, why this is feasible, is that those many, many types of damage can be classified into a much more manageable number of categories of damage. I normally talk about just 7 categories of damage. And the utility of this classification is that for each of the categories, we have a generic approach to doing the damage repair, a generic therapy, which may differ in detail from one example of within the category to another, but only in detail. So without going into too much detail, let me just give, for illustration, one of the categories. So I'll talk about loss of cells. So one thing that happens in the body, in various parts of the body over life, is that cells die and are not automatically replaced by cell division. Of course, in most parts of the body, when cells die, they are replaced by cell division, but there are some exceptions, including the brain, the heart, various other places. When that happens, of course, the number of cells is going to progressively go down over time, and the body will be set up to tolerate a certain amount of cell loss. Like I mentioned, the body is always set up to tolerate a certain amount of each type of damage, but eventually there's too few cells to allow the tissue to do its job the way it normally was. And that's when pathologies start to emerge. So Parkinson's disease is an example for that. Now, the reason I use I've chosen this one type of damage to highlight and to go into details on is because the way to repair that type of damage is already something that everyone in the audience knows of, and you know too, namely stem cell therapy. That's really what stem cell therapy is, right? You put cells into the body that you have prepared in the laboratory into the right state so that they know what to do, so that they know how to divide and differentiate, transform themselves into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And so that, of course, repairs the damage. It restores the number of cells and it prevents or indeed eliminates the pathology that was arising from having too few cells.
Okay. Well, wow. When as you're saying this, it sounds like such an interesting field because, again, at least from an American perspective, you just kind of hear, it seems like all things just sound like they're kind of getting worse. And, at least, again, for me, a person that's not necessarily deep into this field where I'm, reading all the academic papers coming out, just, when I see little blips in the media or online, it's always kind of more negative sounding, like I was mentioning earlier, the fact that life expectancy is down. And I feel like, well, you know this far better than I do. Why do you feel like the media isn't really talking about people that are doing your type of work? Like, why isn't your work more talked about, at least in America?
Well, I guess it depends what media you watch, really, because I spend my life on camera. And I've been doing this for a long time now. I was on 60 Minutes in 2006. I've been on Barbara Walters and Colbert and God knows what, absolutely everything. So I wouldn't exactly say that the media is suppressing or neglecting this space. I think it's just that, some people want to find out about these things and some people don't.
But I guess I just meant more like, I feel like this research should be talked about like on a weekly basis by like a CNN or something. I guess that's more of the field that I was thinking about is that.
That's happening too. I mean, since you mentioned CNN, let me highlight something that's worth mentioning because it's topical. So the main medical guy on CNN, Sanjay Gupta, who at some point was almost going to be appointed the chief medical officer of the US government some years ago, he actually, he's interviewed me. He is, very interested in this area. He's actually just in the process right now of starting a new conference series jointly with another good friend of mine named Mark Hodosh, who started TED Med. And they're coming together to create a new conference series called Life Itself, in which all of the stuff that I do and that I'm talking about all the time will be a very prominent component.
Oh, well, great. I'm definitely glad to hear that. Yeah, because the work that you're doing is so, literally world altering, if we're talking about life expectancies growing exponentially, like you mentioned, aging is the number one cause of pain and suffering in people's lives. And, as you see people get older, it sometimes it's sad. You go to a senior center, or I guess in the U.S. we call them old folks homes. You go there and you see people that are 89 years old, and it's sad. And sometimes they're sad, where they can't really move, they can't really do anything, and it's very difficult sometimes. And for a lot of families, it really does cause a lot of pain in their lives, where they have to take care of their dad or grandfather or grandmother or whatever.
And actually, that brings me to the psychology of all of this, because you're absolutely right. Everything you said, you're completely correct. So the question is, what is the consequence of that? And in particular, what has been the consequence of that tragedy since, the beginning of civilization? Because let's face it, we've known about this terrible thing called aging for a very, very long time. I mentioned earlier on that, a couple of hundred years ago, so many people died in infancy and in early life that life expectancy was really low. But of course, it still meant that some people, if you got through that period of life, then your chances were pretty good that you would get old enough to suffer from aging one way or another. So we've been aware of this. And of course, we've known perfectly well that there's absolutely nothing we can do about it, that it absolutely hits everybody at a reasonably predictable age, though you did mention, of course, there is some variation, if nothing else does, if you haven't been eaten by a tiger in the meantime. Right. So, what does one do psychologically? If there's this terrible thing that's going to happen, the only option is to find some way to trick oneself into putting it out of one's mind and getting on with one's miserably short life and making the best of it rather than, being preoccupied by this ghastly thing. And so, constructed the most utterly embarrassing, edifice of falsehoods and nonsense to do this. And, all the excuses that people give that try to, argue that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, like, making up problems that would be created if we didn't have aging that would be, people will actually say, I wouldn't want to live a long time because all my friends would be gone. How many milliseconds does it take anybody to work out that it is completely absurd to suppose that you would be the only person who actually had access to these therapies? Things like that. People will actually say these things with a straight face. And the only way that I can really explain it is, as I say, people just are terrified of emotionally engaging with all of this. They just have to kind of find some way to avoid getting their hopes up and thinking about what's going to happen.
To even kind of illustrate your point, there was this movie that just came out, The Irishman. I'm sure you've heard of it. The commercials are being blasted all over the place. But in the film, this isn't necessarily a spoiler, but it takes place with Robert De Niro in a retirement home, I guess, so to speak. And yeah, his life looks incredibly sad. You see him on camera, he's in a wheelchair, can't really do a lot of physical things anymore. He's alone. He's basically just watching TV all day. And again, I mean, I don't necessarily hang around old people all the time, like elderly people, they're 80 plus, but it seems like a lot of them just watch TV and don't really do a lot. And they, again, I mean, I don't want to put ideas in other people's minds, but
that's absolutely right. But you have to ask, why do they do that? And the answer, of course, is because of aging. Because they are not in a physical or mental condition to do the kinds of things that they used to do 50 years earlier. And that is precisely the problem that we are going to be fixing. So, yes, I mean, that is a hugely prevalent misconception about what this work entails. People fixate on the longevity aspect and just put out of their minds the fact that the longevity aspect is purely and obviously a side effect of keeping people youthful, which is the actual point. Now, one doesn't find people who want to get sick when they get old. One doesn't even find people who want anybody else to get sick when they get old, except possibly their mother-in-law, right? So the fact is that the only explanation for why people are so insistent on, maintaining these absurdities in their mind as reasons why this is not really a priority is because they just don't want to emotionally engage. They don't want to get their hopes up.
So I guess one more question I wanted to ask you was, I guess, about the field of transhumanism. I'm not sure if that really intersects at all with the work that you're doing, but do you have any ideas on that? And does it relate to the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, so, it's a bit double-edged. So there's a real distinction between what things come under the category of transhumanism and, on the other hand, the word transhumanism. So really what transhumanism is simply the understanding that radically advanced technologies that could allow us to do things that we totally can't do right now would be very valuable. They would hugely increase people's quality of life, as well as, of course, potentially quantity of life. So certainly a lot of people would say that work on bringing aging under comprehensive medical control is very much a major aspect of transhumanism. And I wouldn't really dispute that. I think that's basically true. However, I do have a problem with the language. I think that it is unfortunate that a word like that has been coined to encompass such technological work, because what it does is it gives people the impression that we're trying to create some kind of new species, that we're trying to transform humanity into something completely different, when in fact that's not true at all. The only idea here is to recognize that the progress that we've made in improving humanity's quality of life through technology over the past millennia is a process that is continuing, and that is in no danger of topping out anytime soon and leveling off. In fact, just the opposite. So, that's what we really need to do. We need to emphasize the continuity and thereby make people comfortable and enthusiastic about this progress of technology rather than scared of it.
Because, I mean, again, it just from my own perception, it seems like there is a growing fear of technology in certain regards. I mean, you hear, for example, China's social credit system, and I know that's not necessarily only technology related. It's kind of more technology mixed with, a policy run by government. But it seems like there is a little bit of hesitation of technology, or a little this idea of, I guess a little fear. But like you were saying, though, I mean, if implemented the right way, I mean, there's always technological advances always happening. And, I mean, you might not want to have a microchip put in your head that, that the government can control you through, potentially. I mean, no one wants that to happen. But of course, everyone wants technology to advance in other regards. And it seems like in the medical field, that's what people should want. And I agree with you, this idea that, I don't want to live a long time because my friends won't be there. It's like, well, take that into consideration. If you find a spouse, say, well, I feel guilty about, having a girlfriend because my friends are single. No one thinks like that. And I agree. I mean, you've probably heard people say a lot of outlandish things related to this field. And I'm sure you probably just laugh it off, and you probably think to yourself, if this guy you're talking to, if he was given the choice to live to be either 1,000 or 100, he's probably going to choose 1,000 every time. So, yeah, well, definitely. I want to thank you so much for your time coming on. How can we follow your work? I mean, are you active on on Twitter, or do you make videos on YouTube? Are you like, how can we follow everything that you're doing? Do you have any new books coming out? How can we keep up with your work?
So, of course, the first place the first place to go is always our website, SENS.org. S for sugar, E for elephant, N for November, S for sugar.org. That has huge amounts of information for every kind of audience, all the way from novices through to experts. Lots of news about what we're doing, what other people are doing. You know, it's a very useful resource. And yes, absolutely, we're active on social media of all kinds, and it's easy to find that stuff. And of course, you can write to us if you have questions that you don't know the answers to. We have a contact form on our website that's very easy. We also have a nice, big, friendly donate button, because at the end of the day, that's what keeps us going and allows us to do this work. That's really what it's all about. But yes, thank you for making that point about the psychology of all of this. You know, people do say the craziest things about this, and I wouldn't say I laugh it off, actually. I would say that it's a major frustration. It's a huge source of sadness to me that people are so that people are so willing to embarrass themselves in these ways on this particular topic, when in every other topic they were perfectly rational and intelligent. Because, I mean, the reason it's sad, of course, is that it's slowing things down. This research is inherently expensive, and therefore it goes more slowly when it's not financially supported. And of course, the level of enthusiasm among the general public for this work is the major determinant of the extent to which it's financially supported. So this is really why I spend so much of my life on stage and on camera and behind a microphone, like right now, talking about this and trying to get people to see that they have no excuse. They've got to really actually be rational about this.
I mean, I know for myself, I mean, I'm under 30 years old, and if you had to ask me, would I rather live to be 70 or 60, I'm always going to choose 70. So, I mean, if it's the same thing, if we're talking about would I rather live to be, 80 or, let's say potentially, let's just throw out 150. I'd rather live to be 150. I mean, you might well say to yourself, you only want to live to 150 if you know that you're going to be healthy for at least almost all of that time. And people just jump to the conclusion that they're not going to be healthy, that their life, ever since the age of, let's say, 70 or 80, is going to be characteristic of the quality of life that is seen of people of that age today. And it doesn't matter. I mean, you can even tell them, no, dummy, that's not the case. But they'll still have real trouble really believing that you mean it. Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Grey. I appreciate your time and everything, and I hope to talk to you again.
Likewise. Thanks very much for having me. Bye-bye.
Take care.